Are you ready to try a blockbuster formula for custom data validation? Before we do this, let's remove all data validation settings by selecting the cells that contain data validation, opening the menu again, and clicking Clear All. If you have data validation in multiple areas on a worksheet, it will be easier to select the entire worksheet and then clear all from this menu. Now this time, we want to apply data validation settings to the entire ID column. We may later add other rows with non-dessert food items, such as starters or main courses, to the same list. To allow us to differentiate easily, we want the IDs to start with S- for starters, M- for main courses, and D- for desserts. Now, what function can we use to tell Excel what a value should begin with? We can use the left text function because it allows us to extract a certain number of characters from a text string starting from the leftmost character in a cell. This is the syntax for the left function. The first argument can be text given in inverted commas, or we can reference a cell containing text. The second argument allows us to specify how many characters we want to extract from our text string, starting from the left. So if we write out this function, we are telling Excel to extract the first two characters from the value D-123. We can type this into an empty cell just to check what happens. And we end up with just D- because those are the first two characters in the text value we specified. Now, how would this translate into a data validation formula? When we are writing formulas for data validation, we are telling Excel what criteria to check against. Have a look at this new syntax. This translates to saying that starting from the left, the two characters in cell A2 must be equal to D-. If this is correct, our function will return the value true. Since we have a value in cell A2 already, let's type this function into cell A3 to check. And we get true because cell A2 passes our test. Following this logic, can you figure out what the function syntax for starters and main courses would be to test that they meet our ID criteria? All we have to do is swap the D in our function for an S and an M. Now the big question is, how do we put this all together so that the cells in column A can start with either S-, M-, or D-? We have to use yet another logical function, and because we want to give options, we will use the OR function. Our function will contain the three arguments we just wrote, separated by commas. Before we test this out, let's take this one step further. Let's add another criteria to specify the text length of our ID values using the len function again. If our prefixes S-, M-, or D- are followed by 3-digit numbers, this would make our total text length 5 characters long. So we need to add in this function to show this. Now how can we combine this function with our previous OR function? We will need to embed both these functions as arguments into an AND function like this. Now don't worry, it can get a bit overwhelming, but if we just break this down into parts, it becomes much easier to read. We are saying that both these arguments must be true for our inputs to be valid. For input values to be allowed, they must either start with S- or M- or D-, and at the same time, they should be exactly 5 characters long. Now, when writing nested functions, we need to be very careful of inserting brackets in the right place, keeping the order of operations in mind so that our function works smoothly. Let's test this formula out by entering it into data validation settings for the entire column. So select column A and then click Data Validation. Untick this box since we want all ID numbers filled in again. Now let's enter our formula in this field. Are we missing anything? Well, remember that we are working with relative cell references. Therefore, we have to insert the cell reference of the top leftmost cell in our data validation formula. Since we just selected the entire column A, our top leftmost cell is now A1. So we have to change this, otherwise our formula won't work correctly. And we're ready to go. Let's apply and test. In cell A2, let's enter D-789. Great, that's a valid value as we wanted it to be. Now let's try D-6789. And we get an error because although our value starts with a D dash, it is 6 characters long instead of 5. Let's try entering A-456 into the next cell, and again we get an error, but if we retry and change the A to M, Excel should accept the value. This can actually be quite a lot of fun once you get into it. Now there is one last thing I'd like to show you. Take a look at this. These two cells have the same ID, yet Excel has accepted them since they both passed the data validation test. But in reality, each item should have a unique ID number, which means there should be no duplicates. We can use the COUNTIF function to help us prevent duplicate values. The COUNTIF function counts the number of cells that meet the criteria we specify. This is the syntax in cell A1 if we don't want any values in column A repeated. We are saying that Excel should check the value entered into cell A1 against all the values in column A. If there are no duplicates, the count should be less than or equal to 1, which is effectively 0 or 1. When we enter this formula into data validation, if a value returns true, it will be considered valid and therefore it will be a unique ID. Would you like to have a go at combining this with our blockbuster formula and win an Oscar? There we go. It's not as difficult as it seems once we manage to get our head around all the brackets. Time to test. Now take note of our two identical ID numbers. Let's select column A, go to data validation, and enter our formula. This time, let's ignore blanks and press OK. Now let's ask Excel to circle our invalid entries and see what happens. Sure enough, Excel has picked up on the two duplicates as well as the column header. Let's change one of the cells to D-456 and the red circle will be removed. Now why is cell A4 still circled when it's no longer duplicated? We just need to refresh this cell by clicking on it and pressing enter, and the red circle should disappear. Now our column header was included in our data validation initially because we wanted to apply the data validation settings to the entire column, so we just selected the whole column. Since we don't actually need it, we can remove the data validation settings in just this individual cell. The data validation formula in other cells will not be affected, and this will get rid of the red circle. Wow! We've really covered lots of ground in this topic, and it's essential for you to practice and review all the concepts we have learned. As we've seen, data validation is a great tool that increases the quality of data by restricting what values a user can input. It makes working in Excel more efficient, particularly when working with lookup functions. We can use it to restrict the type or range of values that can be input into cells. We can also use it to create drop-down lists to restrict values allowed in cells, and then use these drop-down lists for our VLOOKUP functions. We can create prompt messages to alert users about data validation rules, and display error messages if data entered is invalid. We can also use data validation to determine the validity of input values based on formulas or calculations in other cells.